it's really important that we analyse, like, how did we get here? How did we get to this point that you have this tremendous no vote against all the odds a week ago, and then less than a week comes and it's effectively sold out by the Syriza leadership. And for me, the most important point is that we did not get here because of any failure, any lack of courage or heroism or conviction on behalf of the Greek masses. The Greek workers, Greek young people have been and remain, absolutely defiant in terms of their opposition to austerity. And there's no problem here with the masses. And actually, the lesson to be learned is that the masses are so much further ahead and so much better than their leadership of Syriza in this case. And there is, within this tragedy, an enormously inspiring lesson about just people pushed to a certain point where they can't take any more and still willing, just despite all the fear and everything else, to stand up and fight back. And that lesson is embodied in the referendum victory, which shouldn't be forgotten. Even in months' time or whatever, it shouldn't just be remembered as just a defeat and a sellout of people. But the referendum should be remembered as a moment when it's one of the most heroic stances taken by working people for decades on this continent, at least, standing up against just the array of forces ranged against them and nonetheless voting no. Because, say in the South, we've experience of rigged referendums which are completely biased. The second referendums we've had on the Lisbon Treaty and the Nice Treaty, big fear campaigns where people were forced to vote yes, even though they didn't want to, but because they were told that a disaster would unfold if they didn't. The same with the fiscal treaty. You've seen the Scottish referendum campaign where the same big fear campaign took place. But what happened in Greece in the week of the referendum put all of that in the shade. It made them look like really fair fights. The referendum campaign unveiled in the most brutal way the lack of democracy within the European Union, the lack of respect for people's right to make democratic choices, and the effective dictatorship that we have of the interests of the banks, the bondholders, the 1% in Europe. And the forces ranged against them went from the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who intervened non-stop, the head of the European Parliament, a supposed Democrat, a supposed Social Democrat, who was one of the most aggressive in saying, like the rest of them, that you have to vote the way we want you to vote, otherwise you're out of the Eurozone, and promising to begin to talk about humanitarian aid, not in order to give any succour or support to the Greek people, but in order to threaten people with humanitarian catastrophe that would come if they didn't vote the way they were meant to vote. Obviously Angela Merkel, the Southern Irish government, Enda Kenny, Michael Noonan, really stabbing the Greeks in the back or in the front, effectively, playing the good pupils of austerity, allowing themselves to be used and allowing Irish people to be used as a stick to beat the Greek people with, and extending down then to the Greek opposition parties, the right-wing opposition parties that were completely involved in this coordinated campaign of fear and terror against the people to try and force them to vote no. Leaked papers that came out from New Democracy proves just how coordinated that campaign was between the European establishment and the Greek establishment, and then as a crucial part of that, coordinated in terms of the Greek media. And we're all used to very biased media, very anti-left, anti-worker media, but again, what happened in Greece in the course of the week of the referendum campaign was unprecedented in the last decades in Europe. Just the scale and open bias. There's two big Greek private TV channels, Sky and Mega, and in the course of it was Mega is owned by one of the big shipping oligarchs who don't pay their any taxes, dominate the Greek economy, etc. They at one moment they interviewed 36 members of the Greek public about what they thought about the referendum taking place, and every single one of those they interviewed thought it was a terrible idea to have a referendum, that it was threatening the existence of the country, democracy, etc., etc. On coverage of the yes and no side, between all the different channels, the yes rally got more than 47 minutes of coverage compared with the no rally's 8 minutes of coverage. The day before the referendum, which is supposedly a day of reflection or whatever, where there's no media coverage, Sky had TV panel debates with only yes people on it. And they had loads of debates before even the moratorium came into place, but with the moratorium in place, they continued to have that kind of just incredible propaganda. And effectively you had, at the start of the week, a definite attempt to cancel the referendum, an attempt to bring down the government and replace it with a technocratic government, a government of national unity. And while the Troika were negotiating with the Syriza government, they were also negotiating at the same time with the leaders of the opposition parties who had lost the last elections badly, but trying to create the basis for a new government. And then once the referendum was going ahead, they intervened everything with a campaign of fear to try and get people to vote the right way from their point of view. And it wasn't empty threats. The European Central Bank and the power of the European Central Bank on banking systems within the euro means that it was a threat that was full and was loaded with the threat to bring down the Greek banking system. And again, something that must be fairly unprecedented. The European Central Bank is responsible for the proper functioning of banking systems across Europe, across the Eurozone, including in Greece. And the European Central Bank deliberately tried to create a bank run in a banking system that it's responsible for, whereby they basically said to people, the Greek banks are running out of money, you better go and get it. The Greek banks, the European Central Bank, since the moment Syriza has come to power, has been turning the screw on the Greek banking system, and then in particular when the referendum was called. Where the Greek banks, like the southern banks at a certain stage, are completely reliant on what's called emergency liquidity assistance from the European Central Bank to survive, to function, and they have 89 billion euros worth of that. And they just put the cap on at 89 billion euros and said, you can't have any more. That's what was responsible then, that the Greek government had no choice but to put the limit on people taking their money out of their ATMs of €60 a day, capital controls in terms of the right of people, to companies in particular, to take large amounts of money out of the country. But it was all done consciously to create these ATM queues, which weren't all that big at all, that the media could come and focus on when they didn't pay any attention to the queues at the soup kitchens or the food banks over the past whole number of years, just to create a climate of fear and to force people to vote yes. And the Greek people knew very well that a consequence of voting no, if their government followed that, could well be that the Greeks would be out of the Eurozone. And despite all of that, they voted no regardless. And they didn't all vote no wanting to leave the Eurozone, but they voted no in the knowledge that it was certainly a possibility, and whereby, the Syriza government had always said, we have a dual mandate to stop austerity and also to stay in the Eurozone. But the referendum clarified that dual mandate, that the mandate actually simply comes down to their mandate was to stop austerity at any cost, even if it meant being outside of the Eurozone. So against all of it, they voted no, and it wasn't just a vote. So it wasn't what the Syriza leadership planned, but with the referendum campaign, it opened up a process of mobilisation from below. It gave a space for some of the energy that had dissipated over the past couple of years of the movements to redevelop, and where at a local basis you had in all the different local areas a coming together of Syriza activists on the ground, other left activists on the ground like Sakinima's activists, the sister party of the Socialist Party in Greece, people from Antarcia, another left-wing group in Greece, coming together, working together to maximise the no vote. And then on the Friday before the referendum, you had the biggest rallies to take place in Greece since 2011, since the Squares movement, which was like the Indignados movement, its reflection in Greece. Maybe 300,000 people on the streets of Athens, and then tens of thousands of people in other cities right across Greece. And at those rallies, which I had the privilege of being at, an almost revolutionary mood in the sense that people were there to send a message to the Troika. No, they wouldn't take more austerity, but also to send a message to their own government. No more steps back. Don't give any more concessions to Troika tyranny. And then the third element of this mobilisation was the vote itself, where the vote itself was a mobilised vote driven by workers and driven by young people. Over 70% of public and private sector employees voted no. More than that of unemployed people voted no. Over 85% of young people under the age of 24 voted no. And as you go up the age limits, the no's decline. It was very youthful driven and working class driven vote. And potentially it was, and it still can be in a sense, but potentially it was like a major turning point and a blow struck on all of our behalf of the 99% of working class people across Europe against the kind of Europe that we currently have. And potentially it could have been like a turning point if the government had taken their mandate seriously from the people, a turning point whereby the kind of neoliberal onslaught that Thatcher, Reagan, collapse of the Berlin Wall, sell out of social democracy, move to the right of the trade union leaders, that all of that opened up, and all defeat after defeat for working class people, where it could have been a significant turning point in the beginnings of a big fight back by people standing up, the 99%, developing a strategy of confrontation against the 1% and inspiring people across Europe. And an important question is, like, how did the Greeks manage to withstand all of that fear? Because I don't think there is another working class or another people in Europe that at this stage could have withstood the kind of fear that was ranged against them. I think in most countries, people would have felt bad about it, but most people would have felt that they had to vote yes. That isn't because of something, intrinsic to the Greek blood or temper or whatever, but it's because of the experiences they've been through. In particular, the experience of austerity over the past 7 years, which has created a situation of absolute misery in Greek society. Mass impoverishment, 10,000 people have died by suicide since the start of the crisis, mass increase in homelessness, of depression. Every single indicator of a societal breakdown is through the charts. And the level of austerity that is unprecedented outside of wartime, whereby the economy contracted, decreased by a quarter. The economy is 3/4 the size now of what it was before the crisis, where almost 1 in 3 workers are now unemployed, and where only 9% of those who are unemployed are entitled to any unemployment benefit. A situation where pensions have been cut in half, and half of all pensioners support an entire family on their one solitary income, and it can be a multi-generational family unit. A situation where a third of private sector workers earn less than €300 a month in kind of precarious part-time work. So incredible situation created for people, and also the economy, because they saw the shrinking of the economy, and they saw that the debt ballooned from 110% of GDP to 180% of GDP as a consequence of this austerity. So more than anybody else, more than all the talking heads, the economists, etc., they understood that more austerity, more of the same medicine would result in more of the same result, further contraction in the economy, further austerity, the debt becoming more and more unsustainable. I think also you can ascribe the victory of the no to the 7 years of struggle, the different waves and different forms, the general strikes, the mobilisations, the squares movement, the election of Syriza, which helped to create a confidence, a sense of solidarity, and ability of people to resist the onslaught that can't just be created just like that out of nothing. And together they created this absolutely historic result. The problem is that last night that result was torn up and forgotten by the Syriza leadership. That's unfortunately reality, and we have to. There's no point in sugarcoating what has happened and trying to pretend it hasn't happened, or like some people are still trying to say, this is the latest tactical genius as a way of like bringing the unwitting Greek masses towards a stage of understanding the need to rupture from capitalism, etc. Like, it's not. It really isn't. I'm certain that it's not. It's a betrayal and a sellout of the Greek people. How did that happen? How did we end up in this situation? And unfortunately, it was not unpredictable, right? So when I was there a week ago, and I was staying with our leading members of our sister party in Greece, they predicted this exactly. They thought that they'd win a no vote, and then the next day go into negotiations and try and sell it out. That was what was clear. And from the minute the no vote took place, all the signals from Tsipras and the leadership of Syriza were in that direction. The speech he made after the referendum victory was incredibly conciliatory to the right and to the so-called creditors. The getting rid of Varoufakis, finance minister, had important symbolic significance, whereby he was a problem for the so-called creditors, he was a problem for the Troika, because he didn't play by the rules in terms of how these negotiations are meant to be carried out. And he published the documents, he leaked the documents having open negotiations, and he spoke over the heads of various finance ministers. So he was on the radio, say, in Morning Ireland, on a number of occasions, speaking to the people as opposed to just speaking to the finance ministers. All of that is massively offensive to the Troika, who then demanded his head on a plate, and then Tsipras gave it to him, to them, as an indication of goodwill and their want to do a deal. I think it also was significant that Varoufakis had mentioned the possibility of going for some sort of parallel currency, but that was probably a final straw for Tsipras, who has no intention of going down that road. So he was gone. That created immediately a mass worry and concern in Greek society that they were going to be sold out very quickly. They then had a meeting with the leaders of the other political parties, which agreed a very soft joint proposal of the forces that were rotten and were absolutely involved in the fear campaign, etc., New Democracy, PASOK, the river. I mean, even from the point of view of, because it came up at the meeting we had last night, well, why did he have the referendum if he intended to do this? But the referendum was designed as a negotiating tactic, which is what they openly said. It was partly designed, as the new finance minister has said, because they couldn't get it through the parliament themselves, whereby they had gone with a proposal that included a lot of austerity. The Troika had rejected it because they wanted rid of Tsipras, or at least they wanted the Syriza party split and a new government. Tsipras comes back with a referendum proposal, not understanding the dynamic that would create in terms of the creditors then reject it absolutely, go on the offensive, and it opens up a mobilisation from below of forces to the left of Syriza and Tsipras, certainly the Syriza leadership in Greece. That wasn't expected, and then the scale of the no victory. I think they wanted a no, but a small enough no to strengthen their negotiating hand and then to go and do a deal. The scale of the no shocked them. They were up all night wondering, what the fuck can we do with this now that this is a real problem from the point of view of their negotiating tactic, but they nonetheless went with the same strategy that they went to go. And the reason none of that was unpredictable and is unfortunately not that surprising, it doesn't make it any less of a defeat or any less, disappointing, is because it's rooted in their strategy. Their strategy is fundamentally a reformist strategy, as in they think that within this capitalist system that you can go some of the way to making a better society, that you could break with some of the demands of the creditors, some of the debt, some of austerity, but without seriously confronting the rules of capitalism. And it's a particular variant of reformism in a particular time and place, where it's the variant of reformism which is like a good Euro strategy, which is committed to staying in the Euro. They never said this, but it was always their strategy, to staying in the Euro at all costs. They were unwilling to envisage the idea of a break from the Eurozone in a context when they are in a peripheral country on the edge of a currency zone that is dominated by dominant capitalist powers like German capitalism, which is in a moment of absolute domination of neoliberal right-wing Thatcherite ideas, and where the space for reformism and for reforms is practically zero. It doesn't really exist, where any attempt to break from their rules results in them coming down on you like a ton of bricks because they want all their money back. They're not willing to concede anything. And so, like, the dilemma always facing Syriza was, okay, like, they went anticipating that they'd be able to negotiate, not with massive illusions that like Merkel or Dijsselbloem or whoever were nice people, but that that they would be under some pressure to respect the democratic mandate of Syriza, to respect the referendum at a later stage, that they'd be forced to give some concessions. There was a very interesting insider's report from the Greek side on a French website, mediapart.fr, that people should see. It's on Facebook, and it reveals just how unprepared they were for the reality of the class conflict that they were entering into. That these people were not open to serious negotiations. They represented the interests of the other side. And so the illusions that Syriza and Tsipras tried to create from the moment they were elected, that they would do an honourable compromise, was never going to happen. These people were not up for any part of any serious compromise, that they were out to humiliate the Greek government and out to send a message to other people across Europe that don't go down the road of the left, it'll be disastrous. And so if that means crushing them economically, do that. If it means crushing them politically and bringing them down and replacing them with someone else, will then do that. And so they just underestimated all of that as a result of their reformist conception, and a particular reformist conception relating to the Eurozone and relating to the European Union, underestimating how fundamentally undemocratic and dictatorial and of the bosses that organisation is. And then they never developed a plan B. They just stuck with plan A, until it gets to the point that the Greek banks, if a deal was not done by Monday or Tuesday, the Greek banks will simply be unable to open. They have no money. And so they're right up against the wall of this historic decision, which is to concede to just give everything away to demoralise people, or to go for confrontation, to go for rupture with the Eurozone, to begin printing your own currency, and to take radical socialist measures. And they just allowed themselves to be trapped, and for negotiations to go on and go on, and for the Greek economy to weaken and to weaken, for the money to leave Greek society until they're faced with this decision, completely unprepared for it, and then just collapse into betrayal. And the betrayal is of a different sort than the betrayal, say, people in the South experienced with the Labour Party, because the Labour Party was always out to betray. They didn't really betray because the Labour Party was never, hasn't been a party of workers. They were always going to implement horrific austerity, etc., etc. Here, Tsipras and the leadership people of Syriza, I'd say they feel bad about it. They wish they could do something different. They consider themselves to be on the left of a certain type, but it doesn't mean that it's not a betrayal of the 61% who voted no. It clearly is. Was there an alternative? Because that's what they'll say, and their hangers-on and so on will say now. That's effectively the Sinn Féin line as well. What else could they have done? There was an alternative. It would have been much better if Plan B and a project of rupture had been started a number of months ago after Syriza was elected. If Syriza had been honest in terms of the election campaign and explained that you can't stick with the rules and get rid of austerity, you have to break the rules and confront. It would have been much better if they did that then at the start and prepared for capital control, stop the money leaving, public ownership, new currency, etc. That's true. By not doing so, they allowed the situation to worsen and put themselves where a Plan B is more difficult. But even at this stage, there was and is an alternative. And effectively the alternative is to break the rules of capitalism as embodied in the Eurozone. Concretely, what that means right away is that you need to reopen your banks. That means you would need to print your own currency. That can be a short-term currency initially, an IOU type of currency that can then be later replaced with another currency. That does not have to be an absolute disaster. Greece last year had a trade surplus. They exported more than they imported. And they also have a primary balance, so the state takes in more in tax revenue than it spends on public services. The reason it has a deficit is because it pays huge amounts of money, 20 billion already, another 20 billion to go this year on debt repayments. So if that was married with a strategy of socialist policies and of really confronting the European powers, for example, full nationalisation of the banks and a burning of the bondholders. Even the Financial Times the other day said if they just burnt the junior bondholders, the banks would then be solvent from the point of view of ordinary people, and therefore ordinary people wouldn't lose their savings or the use of the banks. Then use the banks in proper public ownership under democratic control as a utility for the economy to give credit to small businesses, farmers, etc. Major public investment paid for by taking, for example, the unpaid tax revenues of about 15 billion euros of about 16 families in Greece of the oligarchs, taking that wealth in various forms, using it for public investment to try to redevelop the economy, public ownership of the key sections of the economy, and a democratic plan of investment and production, because these people are on strike since the referendum happened. They're half on strike since Syriza came to power. They're not going to invest and improve the economy. That power has to be taken out of their hands. And crucially, and this is the benefit and the key benefit immediately that you have of going for this road of rupture, is that you don't pay the step back. The 20 billion already, the 20 billion still to come this year, that you have a primary surplus, probably don't anymore in reality, but you did have, and that by breaking their rules you're able to write off this debt. And it's one of the good things that this Greek government has done, is it initiated a debt audit process looking into the debt that has preliminarily reported and said that the Troika debt is odious and illegal and illegitimate, and because all of it effectively went to just pay out the banks. None of it went into the Greek economy, to the Greek people. It was a debt that's now placed on the Greek people's shoulders, but is for bailing out the European banking system. So you complete your debt audit. In the meantime, you pay nothing. You finish your debt audit, and then you refuse to pay a very large portion of the debt, which again lifts a burden off the economy. That's not, some road that's paved with gold and is easy, etc. That's clear. There would be difficulties in that road. There are problems in terms of you'd have to import an amount of food, of energy, of pharmaceuticals. Those things could be managed with a democratically planned economy. Not just forever into the future developing this like socialist paradise in Greece, Cuba within the European Union, but as a step of rupture in one country within the European Union, and then like an inspiring message to people in Spain and Portugal and Ireland, elsewhere, that then other countries would take a similar road, and in that way you begin to reconstruct on a completely different democratic basis, a different type of Europe that actually works in the interest of the millions as opposed to the millionaires. Just finally, in terms of, like, that's what should have happened. What happens now? One scenario which is still possible is it's still possible that the Germans say no. That like you've humiliated yourself so much and that's great, but we just want to humiliate you one more time, and that they ask, because they're completely on their knees now. They've just laid themselves over a barrel where they've no other choices. Like, all their cards are out in the open, and they're saying we want to stay in the Eurozone at any cost, so we'll take any price to do so. So today and tomorrow they can ask for even more concessions, which the government likely feels they've no choice but to give. It can also be the case that Germany now decides the best message to send to people in Germany and Spain and Portugal and elsewhere now is that, look, they've tried to implement austerity, but we're still going to kick them out of the Eurozone. I don't think that's the most likely thing, but you got maybe a 10-15% chance of something like that happening, in which case Greece then possibly goes on a road of exit of the Eurozone in the most unprepared, disillusioned way that is possible. I think it's still preferable than going on the road of austerity that the leadership is putting them on, but it's like very, very far from an ideal situation. I think most likely is that a deal is done in the next 2 days. The ECB turns on the taps to the Greek society, and austerity is implemented, and it has the very predictable effect, which they all predicted, the Syriza leadership now, that it worsens the crisis, it worsens the situation for people. What's very important is that from this situation, something comes from Syriza. So last night it was good that 2 Syriza MPs voted against. It was disappointing that more Syriza MPs didn't vote against. It's good that the left platform, so the left within Syriza, are going to resign their governmental responsibilities. So the ministers and junior ministers will resign in the coming days and not take responsibility for the implementation of this policy. But more than that is needed, because there's a real danger. Like, the biggest group to vote against the deal last night in the parliament was Golden Dawn, the fascists. That the left, in order not for mass demoralisation and disillusionment to set in, you need to have a message from the left saying, no, this was not inevitable, this is a betrayal of left-wing policies as opposed to a consequence of left-wing policies, and a public coming out for opposition, for mobilisation, appealing to the 61% to continue to say no. Syriza is now effectively finished as a vehicle for fundamental change for Greek people. I mean, a reason that some of the left platform people voted yes was to maintain left unity and to mean that the Syriza can stay in government. But that's like, it's such a lesser consideration than a unity with the 61% who voted no. They do not owe any loyalty anymore to the Syriza party leadership. Their loyalty is to the election programme upon which they were elected and the people who elected them. And so, like, Zekinima in Greece is calling on them to come out clearly and effectively to break with Syriza. I think that there can be a process towards that. It's far too hesitant. It's far too less definite. But I think it's likely that a number will even self-criticise in a number of months and say they probably should have voted no yesterday, and there can be a process towards them exiting. And then you can have a certain reconstruction on the left of a vehicle for people, taking in sections of the left of Syriza which breaks, groups like ourselves, the Kinema, which have an orientation to Syriza, the people in Syriza, but are formally outside of it, but work with the good people inside of it, and with sections of Austerity, which is a radical left force, of whom about half played a good role in the referendum, were non-sectarian, worked with other forces, and you can have the construction of something new. That's what you can hope for at this stage, and hope that there's significant mobilisations from below. That's the only thing that can make a difference at this stage. There were protests last night. I didn't see exactly how big they were. They weren't unsubstantial, but they weren't immense either, which is very, very understandable. Just the last point in terms of like lessons for us here. I think there are profound lessons for us here. One is that, like, if there's anyone out there who still thinks the European Union is some sort of vehicle for democracy or human rights or like progress, like, you'd want to take a very close look at what happened over the past couple of weeks, because it's the most graphic illustration that this European Union is a project of the bosses. It's a fundamentally undemocratic and anti-democratic project, and it's not capable of being used by ordinary people for our benefit. It can't be changed into something that we can use. The road to like a socialist Europe lies outside of this European Union and in confrontation with this European Union. I think that is a lesson that will not be lost on a lot of people, and that's a benefit of what the referendum happening is. It'll harden attitudes and understanding about what the Euro and the EU are about. But secondly, it shows that it's not enough to elect a left government. That doesn't result in victory by itself. It's that people think it's great, oh, we have a left government, everything's solved, etc., etc., but it's not good enough. You need to have a left government that has a left programme and is committed to a strategy of breaking the rules of capitalism, of confronting dominant capitalism and setting out on the road to socialist change, which means not just resting on being in government and negotiating with others, but having a strategy of mobilisation from below. And that is, a profound lesson that like change is really hard. We're up against a very, very significant enemy. But what you can take from Greece is that like the people, the masses, working class people, young people, will not be left, will not let people down. They're the ones who won't let people down. But we need to construct a party, an organisation, a movement that is worthy of them, that is a sharp instrument that understands the scale of the battle that we're up against and is capable of playing a significant role in leading towards victory. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Just firstly, it's important to draw a distinction between the Euro and the EU. And in this scenario, I mean, even with like the best revolutionary leadership in Greece right now, you wouldn't necessarily leave the EU just like that. You'd end up leaving the Euro, you'd use the benefits of being in the EU in terms of the common market, then you'd get kicked out of the EU eventually as well, probably. But for now, the key question on the agenda for Greece would be the Euro and exiting the Euro. And I think even if Greece doesn't exit the Euro, in a way this is still a big turning point whereby a country came extremely close to exiting the Euro. And like Greece is going to be back here again in a few years' time under another government of various hue. We don't know exactly what, because this is going to make the situation worse, etc. The debt deal they will get tomorrow won't be good enough if they get it, won't be good enough to deal with it. So I do think we're in the process of the collapse of the Eurozone, but a reversal of the Eurozone going forward, etc., and crisis of the Eurozone and countries leaving the Eurozone. It's quite a protracted, longer crisis than certainly I expected it to be, because of how important the Eurozone is to the dominant capitalism within Europe, particularly German finance capital, and they want to hold it together. But still, like there's fundamental contradictions in the Eurozone in particular of the different types of the economies between north and south, core and periphery, and like a certain breakup or retreat of the Eurozone I think is inevitable, but it's just difficult to say in terms of the time frame, and it'll still be seen as a significant point even if it doesn't happen at this stage. Point about the US, I mean the US has played a definite role here, there's no question, largely behind the scenes, applying pressure on both sides basically. I mean the US's interest here is that there's a deal to keep Greece in the Eurozone and definitely inside the EU, and their interest comes from the fact that they don't want massive political and economic instability within the EU because of the danger of that coming to America. But above all, their primary interest is the geostrategic significance of Greece's membership of NATO in pretty much the Middle East. I mean, Greece isn't all that far from Palestine, Israel, North Africa, etc. It's like all the way over there in a region that's extremely significant, and what they fear is that Greece leaves the Eurozone, comes out of NATO potentially, out of the sphere of influence of the West, and begins to dabble with Russia, which is why all Tsipras' trips to visit Putin, etc. were about. They were about trying to threaten the West with this prospect of a deal with Russia. So the US has had a definite interest here, and it's applied pressure on both sides behind the scenes. Applied pressure on the Greek government to say you got to do a deal, etc. And it does have power to do that. And then it definitely has applied pressure on Merkel as well to say you also need to do a deal. And US influence is probably central to the fact that there will likely be a deal tomorrow, because we will mainly focus here from the point of view of the left of the moves that Syriza has made, because like that's what we're interested in. But it's also the case that Germany has moved to a very small extent. It'll move to say something about debt relief, which is enough that Syriza needs to have something to be able to justify doing it. And the US influence is no small part of that. Just something that's interesting in terms of what's happening now. I think Kevin's point is important about this isn't necessarily a done deal yet, not because Syriza develop a backbone or anything, and I think most likely it is, but like, because the meeting is just starting now of the finance ministers of the Eurozone in Brussels, and like the mood music coming out is a 50-50 chance of a deal. I think there's more of a chance than that, but that's interesting. And so you have a quote here from the Dutch finance minister, who'd be one of the most hardline, which gives you an illustration of the position that the Greek government has got themselves in now. Right, so the Dutch finance minister says the Greeks have clearly made a step forward. At the same time, the institutions have been critical. The plan is weaker in some areas than it should be. Their suggestion, the institution, is we can only start negotiations when these conditions are filled in. Many governments, including my own, are worried about implementation. We're discussing a proposal that was rejected in a referendum. Clearly, there has to be a step made towards restoring trust with some guarantee that these things will be implemented. Journalists ask, what if there is no agreement tonight? That is up to the Greek government. Because the Greek government has just tied itself whereby it needs the ECB to turn the tap on to reopen the Greek banks on Monday. And like all they can do is sign a deal or not sign a deal, and they don't have the printing presses running, they have nothing ready to go in terms of just like the concrete reality of what a strategy of rupture and like moving towards revolutionary change would mean. They're so unprepared that like it can be the case that such proposals are put to them today and they likely to sign them, but even it can be so much, and if pressure is developing from below, etc., that it can even be too difficult for them to sign it, although I don't think it's the most likely situation. In terms of other questions, question of the Golden Dawn, yeah, I think Stephen is right that, I mean, Golden Dawn is formally well positioned to benefit from this and undoubtedly will benefit from it in the sense that they're the biggest, clearest force now against the agreement. And they didn't campaign hard in the referendum. They barely campaigned at all. They were formally for a no vote, but they didn't do anything for fear of being associated with the left, basically. But now they're denouncing the government. They had Ochi no signs in the parliament last night, trying to associate themselves with the sentiment of the 61%. And certainly they can make gains. I mean, whenever Syriza was seen to be taken on the Troika, a lot of Golden Dawn supporters came behind them and supported them because they were also, standing up for the dignity of people, etc., etc. Obviously, not all Golden Dawn voters, a minority would be hardened fascists. So a space is now opened up for Golden Dawn. That's clear. However, it's not just the case that Syriza's failed Golden Dawn is next to develop a momentum towards power, because of their internal crises, because of the fact that they're in disarray, because their key leaders are in jail or being prosecuted or whatever for various horrific things like killing of immigrants, but they're not particularly well positioned, and there's probably others who can come first, but they certainly could double their support or something, become again a significant force on the street and a real menace from the point of view of the left. In terms of what happens with the left in Greece and what we're calling for, I mean, Zakinima is now calling for a new revolutionary left party, a broad party bringing together different sections of the left, but that draws a lesson from what's been happening and says, okay, we need a strategy of rupture, of revolution, etc. Can that happen? Probably not in the way that exactly we would like it, but there certainly can be something emerge now from Syriza, because Syriza will be racked by crisis. I think the idea that more people would vote no next week is very realistic. This is what happens in left parties, even with left reformists, then seeing the pressure from outside, the reaction of people whereby they have the next time they get a vote, they're more likely to vote no. So there's rumours that there'll be an election in autumn. Obviously, it would not be possible for now us to call for a vote for Syriza, which we did in the past election. That'll be the case for many others, but also currently parts of Syriza. And the question would be that in advance of that election, something could be put together significantly to the left of Syriza, basing itself on the 61% no, and a strategy of rupture and breaking the rules of capitalism and the Eurozone. I think you can identify the parts of the left that can go to construct that. So the initiative of the 1,000 was an initiative of Zakinima in Greece to bring together the best sections of the left inside Syriza with the best non-sectarian sections of the left outside Syriza, that played a role, had significant meetings, including leading figures of the left platform came, people like Lavazanis, who's a leader of the left platform, who's a government minister for another few days, and it had an impact on the debate inside Syriza. It helped to strengthen the left inside Syriza and helped to mobilise people outside of Syriza as well. That is now, in reality, surpassed by what's happening, and what something more significant needs to take place. That there's the grounds for, so people might know Antarcia, which is like a radical left force in Greece, which includes the equivalent of, or well, one of the two equivalents of the SWP in Ireland and others. And basically Antarcia, in the course of the referendum campaign, had two very different approaches. Some of them adopted the position of the Communist Party, not to call for an abstention, not to engage in the referendum struggle, but others adopted a good position of common work with others on the left calling for a no vote. So there's a basis there of reasonably significant forces to be open to doing something with forces that are currently the other forces outside of Syriza but not in Antarcia, and forces coming from the left of Syriza. That's what you would hope, that something significant can develop there, and that we could be a fairly significant part of, and that can quickly become a big force in society. And that's the point. Like, even Antarcia is an impressive organisation close up. I mean, whenever you had the spontaneous pouring onto the streets after the referendum result, Antarcia came into the square, and they don't do very well in elections, but they have a big presence in the movements, and they just significant numbers of young people, like maybe 1,000, 2,000 people who are clearly party members affiliated to it, etc. That they have, if they didn't have such a sectarian approach, they have a potential for growth. But also the fact that Syriza grew so quickly, a space can open up, because the other thing, the point I meant to make is that a positive here is that the vast majority of people who voted for Syriza did so without loads of illusions, did so with scepticism about Syriza. Nobody really trusted Tsipras. The same with people who voted no. There's already a big question mark of people people believe to some extent the Communist Party slogans that you can't trust Syriza, but they correctly decided, okay, we can't trust them, but we'll vote for them anyway, we'll give them a chance, we'll put them under pressure, etc. So that's good. It means that the blow and the demoralisation can be less profound than it otherwise would be, but also that something new can develop, hopefully quite quickly. Just last couple of points. In terms of the impact across Europe and politics in Europe, I think this will have a lot of effects. I mean, there'll be reverberations of this for a whole period of time, because it's the testing of this new reformism that has been developing, and the failure of this new reformism. And I do think for the mass, this is a disappointing, demoralising process that will, say, in the south, affect some of our voters, not loads of them, but some of them thinking, Jesus, there is no alternative after all, these are their allies and whatever. It'll affect Sinn Féin more, because they're more associated with pretty much the strategy of the right wing of Syriza, even to the right of Tsipras. But it can, and it'll affect Podemos' voters in Spain, and they've been engaged in the last couple of weeks in a strategy to kind of create some clear blue water to the right of Syriza by distancing themselves a little bit to not be damaged by the car crash that was on the way, but not from the point of view of the left, from the point of view of distancing from the right. And so I think it can slow down the process, broadly speaking, to the left. It can have an impact there for a period in time. But on the other hand, the profound discussions you can have with people now about what kind of left we need, because this is not just some abstract thing. It's like when we were all criticising Syriza on social media or whatever for the last while, in a fraternal way, the likes of the Shinners in the north in particular, or whoever in the south, saying, it's typical Trotskyists, just giving out about what you know about anything, well, we got it right, you know what I mean? Unfortunately, we got it right about this, but there is a space to win people now to revolutionary left politics, a bigger space than previously. People, I know loads of people in the south energised by the anti-water charges movement, and whose answer to everything is left unity. It's just so I was putting up posts about the beginnings of a Syriza betrayal, and people say, yeah, but look at Greece, what we need is left unity. So no, we do need left unity of serious, significant left forces who are prepared for confrontation and breaking the rules of capitalism. We do need that. But the second part of that is as important, if not more important, than the first part of it. Because unity doesn't bring you victory, it really doesn't. And so the importance of programme, the importance of strategy, etc., I think we can make definite gains on that basis.